How much of a legend is based in historical fact? In many cases, it's impossible to say. The passage of time has a way of diluting the truth with myth and hyperbole, and right here in the Elder Scrolls series, just like the real world, what often counts the most is who is actually telling the tale. Because history in Tamriel, it's a little bit of a mess, a battleground of opinion and perspective, with every culture, race, and province holding their very own skewed version of not just the past, but of the very gods themselves. And it's in this kind of murky soup of truth and myth where we find one of the most important characters in the entire Elder Scrolls canon, as well as one of the most controversial, unique, and downright strange in all of video game history, the one and only holy warrior known as Pelinal Whitestrake. The star-made knight, the bane of elves, the divine crusader. A man remembered by some in this video game universe as a savior, a hero wielding weapons blessed by the gods that freed his people from the chains of slavery. But by others, he is cataloged as a villain, an indiscriminate killing machine boiling with racism and brutality who soaked the earth with the blood of the innocent. But to all of the above, Pelinal is remembered as an enigma. A character shrouded in an absurd amount of mystery and contradictions, with strange anecdotes and very specific lines in his legend scrutinized by us fans for years as we all try to come to a consensus. Was this character a god in human form? Was he some ancient spirit of warfare? Or was he a time-traveling cyborg?
What?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another video. I am Ghost, your host as always, and on this channel we take long looks at all different types of video game characters and attempt to pinpoint what makes them special or memorable. Now, before we get fully started here, I do want to give a huge thank you to all of my amazing patrons who support this channel away from YouTube. You guys are my favorite. And now all I ask is that you all sit back, relax, and just try to keep an open mind as we discuss my personal interpretation of the one-of-a-kind abstract Elder Scrolls icon that is Pelinal Whitestrake. In the center of Tamriel stands the proud province of Cyrodiil, homeland of the Imperial people and of course, the setting of the Elder Scrolls IV, Oblivion. Rolling green hills, lush forests, a very impressive capital city. I mean, this is an idyllic place. Some might even call it the jewel of the Empire of Men. But beyond that traditional fantasy charm, further exploration here reveals something very significant. Ancient ruins, elven in nature, absolutely litter this landscape. From the occasional open-air well of magic to larger-scale decayed towns and settlements, even the Imperial City itself shares the very same white stone architectural style. Suggestions of an earlier advanced civilization that was either disbanded, dispersed, or dismantled. These are the remnants of what was once the Ayleid Empire, a prehistoric alliance of elven city-states that thousands and thousands of years before this game takes place ruled over the land that they called Cyrid with an iron fist. And it was against these very Ayleids, their people, their customs, and their kings that Pelinal Whitestrake once waged a bloody crusade with the wrath of 1,000 men. Now, this period of history when the Ayleids first came to Cyrodiil is known as the Merethic Era, a time when the Mer, or elves, reigned supreme pretty much everywhere. From their home of the Somerset Isles in the south, the very first elves expanded out in groups all over the continent, exploring, establishing colonies, and just generally taking full advantage of being the only literate people around capable of building societies. Now, humans and beast folk were already living in a majority of these places, it's just that the elves, and specifically this group that came to call themselves the Ayleids, saw no problem in purging or even enslaving local populations wherever they decided to set down roots. So here, in ancient Cyrodiil, two main races already called this place home. The first, a bird-like beast folk that were said to be peaceful, welcoming, and intelligent, but sadly, nothing else is really known of them, as they vanished from recorded history just after their discovery. Now, there are several theories out there regarding the fate of these bird people, but I have personally always assumed the worst when looking at the Ayleids' tradition to adorn themselves in kind of bird-styled armor and colorful feathers. But the other group here was known as the Needs, an early human race that existed kind of all over Tamriel, and they must have been deemed far more useful as instead of being massacred or driven out, they were enslaved and immediately put to work. But as slave masters, these elves, well, they were brutal. History remembers them as quick-tempered, sadistic supremacists that treated these humans as less than animals. But regardless, with the landscape cleared and these men in chains, all these different Ayleid city-states were established and then free to grow and thrive. Cirid became elven land, and every passing century saw this empire amass more magical knowledge, more wealth, and of course more territory, until finally one day, this Merethic period came to an end. The world then entered the First Era, a much more structured time of diverse societies taking shape all around the continent, and after their several hundred years of prosperity, Ayleid culture surprisingly took a sudden downturn. Now, a section of these Ayleids had always participated in Daedra worship, which was frowned upon by many, but that number had grown significantly and become increasingly devout as the years rolled by. This led to things like religious infighting, rebellion, and power-hungry sorcerer kings warring with each other, and as a result of this instability, these Nedic people suffered tremendously, eventually becoming more than just slaves, but objects of torture and even ritualistic Daedric sacrifice. But every oppressed people have their breaking point, and finally, after generations of servitude and abuse, that moment came in the year 242 of the First Era, when a young slave named Alessia, living in the heart of Cirid, was given a divine vision and mission to achieve freedom. She is remembered now as Saint Alessia, the Slave Queen, and as she put a massive uprising in motion to move against her masters, she sent a desperate plea to the 8 divines, begging for help in freeing her people in whatever form the gods could manage, and those prayers were answered. Alessia was granted the favor of Kinnereth, goddess of the heavens and wind, with Kinnereth's own demigod's son, the great winged bull named Morahouse, coming down to Tamriel to guide and assist the Slave Queen. But what's important for this video is that Morahouse did not descend alone, for at his side was another, dressed in shining white, carrying weapons of war, and now I ask that you listen to this passage from the in-game book, The Song of Pelinal Volume 2. And just a note for clarity's sake, Perif is the birth name of Alessia. It's the same person. What I ask now for our alien masters, that we might sunder them fully and repay their cruelty by dispersing them to drown in the Topol. Morahouse, your son, mighty and snorting, gore-horned, winged, when next he flies down, let him bring us anger. And then, Kine granted Perif another symbol, a diamond soaked red with the blood of elves whose facets could unsector and form into a man whose every angle could cut her jailers, and a name, Pelinal, which is the star-made knight, and he was arrayed in armor from the future time. Now, that's very cryptic and strange stuff, but that passage absolutely describes the arrival of Whitestrake, a mysterious warrior delivered to Tamriel as the embodiment of all that anger and vengeance, tasked with liberating the needs and neutralizing their masters. His personality obscured and largely unknown, his status as a living being completely up for debate, like I said, an absolute enigma. The diamond-soaked red could very possibly have been the Amulet of Kings, which was apparently embedded in this character's chest, deep under his armor where a heart ought to be. So this is the moment that the Alessian slave rebellion truly began. An incredibly bloody war that would end up being one of the most important feats in all of Elder Scrolls lore, as it ushered in the first ever golden age of humanity. But hold on a second, man, because that passage was pretty out there, wasn't it? It made it sound like Pelinal is some, gemstone transformer, and also, is he really wearing armor from the future? Well, yeah, those things are true. Or, well, maybe not. Maybe only partially. Honestly, it's completely up to you what all the weird little details in this video mean, because a huge part of this character is that Pelinal is straight up designed to be strange and open for interpretation. Even the in-game source we're pulling all this from, the Song of Pelinal, it's just one super dramatic, almost religious account of these ancient events. However, what is generally accepted as a fact in Tamriel is when Pelinal appeared in the mortal plane to serve Alessia, he came in the humble form of a man equipped with what came to be known as the Crusaders' Relics, a collection of armor and weapons that were crafted personally for Whitestrake and blessed by each one of the 8 divines. A white tabard with a red diamond in the center, and of course, a mace, sword, and shield. And in his first seconds in the mortal world, Pelinal got straight to work. Listen to this excerpt again from Volume 2. And he walked into the jungles of Cirid already killing, Morahouse stamping at his side, froth-bloody and bellowing from excitement because the Pelinal was come. And Pelinal came to Perif's camp of rebels holding a sword and mace, both encrusted with the smashed viscera of elven faces, feathers, and magic beads, which were the markings of the Ayleid Dune. Stuck to the redness that hung from his weapons, he lifted them, saying, These were their eastern chieftains, no longer full of their talking. Damn, that has got to be one of the coldest entrances of all time. He was sent down here to do one thing, kill elves, and believe me, he does a lot more of it. History tells us that Whitestrake then rallied these humans, forming armies, acting as their general, and leading this crusade for freedom with a lethality that is now the stuff of legend. In one-on-one combat, he was simply unstoppably strong, leagues beyond any human or elven foe that the world had ever known, and the Ayleid leaders had no clue who or even what he was. Many of them, I'm sure, took him at face value to simply be a man, a former slave turned warlord that just inexplicably ripped through their ranks and killed king after king. This is cataloged very gruesomely in Volume 3 of the Song of Pelinal. Listen to this. He took it upon himself to slay the sorcerer kings of the Ayleids in prearranged open combats. Pelinal called out Haramir of Copper and Tea into a duel at the Tor and ate his neck veins while screaming praise to Remen, a name that no one knew yet. Gordhaur the Shaper's head was smashed upon the goat-faced altar of Ninindava. Later that season, Pelinal slew Hadhul on the granite steps of Seatar. The Fire King's spears knowing their first refute. For a time, no weapon of the Ayleids could pierce his armor, which Pelinal admitted was unlike any crafted by men, but would say no more even when pressed. Now, one note on the part of him chewing the neck veins and screaming Remen. Well, this is understandably a fan-favorite tidbit of lore because it's just insanely brutal, but it's also one of the very key pieces of evidence that folks point toward when they claim that Whitestrake is some sort of time-traveling robot. Because Remen is the name of the founder of the Second Empire of Men, the Remen dynasty, something that wouldn't take place for another like 2,500 years. But don't worry, I'm going to share all my thoughts on that theory much later on. So apparently, in just one calendar year, Pelinal drove all these elves west and claimed the eastern lands in the name of Alessia. He freed countless human slaves in the process, made contact with the Nords of Skyrim and recruited them to the cause, and of course, slaughtered untold amount of Ayleids all along the way. But there is a hugely important character in the legend of Whitestrake that we have yet to mention. One that you will already know very well if you have played Oblivion, Umaril, the Unfeathered, one of the many sorcerer kings that rose in station and power during this time thanks to his extremely close devotional connection to the Daedric Prince of Light, Meridia. Umaril ruled over what was left of this fracturing empire from the Temple of the Ancestors, what modern Cyrodiilians would know as the White Gold Tower of the Imperial City. And thanks to his own kind of mysterious godlike parentage that I'm not going to get too into here, Umaril was also considered to be just insanely strong on the battlefield. Guided by the Daedra as Pelinal was by the Aedra, so of course, these two were simply fated to eventually cross blades. Well, right about now, you all might be thinking, yes, Pelinal's a little bit barbaric at times, for sure, but still, how is he not considered a hero all across the board? I mean, he fought to free slaves, he was outfitted and sent by the gods themselves, is remembered in modern Cyrodiil as a literal saint. Where's the moral debate? Well, war is no glorious thing. Historians in both fiction and reality often seek to sanitize most of the gory details, glazing over the injustices and crimes of the state and its actors, and the truth of Pelinal Whitestrake is that at some point in this rebellion, something happened that transformed him from a weapon of divine justice into an avatar of blind vengeance. When Huna, whom Pelinal raised from grain slave to hoplite and loved well, took death from an arrowhead made from the beak of Kelthalel the Singer, the Whitestrake went on his first madness. He wrought destruction from Narlame all the way to Celeadil and erased those lands from the maps of elves and men and all things in them, and Perif was forced to make a sacrifice to the gods to keep them from leaving the world in their disgust. I mean, wow. Grief is a powerful, powerful thing. We've covered that simple fact in many of the villain videos right here on this channel, and it does seem that Pelinal became overwhelmed by it. The loss of his lover turning him into this hurricane of destruction, and that's not quite the righteous behavior we expect from one called the Divine Crusader. It's even suggested in these texts that he had the potential to destroy the entire planet if the gods or Alessia did not step in to calm him during these fits of rage, which became increasingly frequent as the war neared its end. The Song of Pelinal Volume 4 describes him massacring entire populations at various Ayleid forts and villages so brutally that Kinnereth had to send days of rain to wash the blood from them. He also at some point was going on one of these rampages and encountered an innocent band of Khajiit which had nothing to do with this war, and he mistook them for elves because of their pointed ears and just killed them all the same. One time, Pelinal returned from a battle with 2,000 severed hands brought back in a wagon made of demon bone. And most chillingly of all, Pelinal led these massive pogroms, intentional, systematic, ethnic cleansing campaigns of elves including women and children all in the north of Cyrodiil, where he stood triumphantly with his white hair turned brown with elven blood. So Whitestrake was this swinging pendulum, entering fevered states of immense violence and then stopping to laugh, sit around the fire with his men before waking up and doing it all again. It is said that he could feel the dragon god of time, Akatosh, staring down at him in judgment, and Pelinal responded by simply staring back. When asked by one of his soldiers what entering these murderous states felt like, he replied, "Like when the dream no longer needs its dreamer." It's fascinating stuff, really. Biblical in the scale of destruction and suffering. Fantastical in the details of him turning entire swaths of land into void and pissing off the gods. So I think you can probably see why so many people out there are deeply interested in this character. One second, he's Paladin Abraham Lincoln, and the next, he's wiping out generations of innocent elves because his boyfriend died. Well, that's Pelinal Whitestrake for you. So at the very end of this war, Alessia's forces had at last closed in around the White Gold Tower, the final symbol of elven domination still standing in Cyrodiil, and true freedom stood but a sword stroke away. Umaril the Unfeathered waited inside with the last remnants of the Ayleid forces as well as some Daedric cronies of his, and then openly challenged Pelinal Whitestrake to come forth, enter the tower, and engage in a duel to decide the war. Pelinal was thrilled at the prospect, and in one of his spurts of anger and bloodlust, brushed off Alessia's call for caution and entered the White Gold Tower completely alone to face his fate. But upon entering the throne room, Pelinal was ambushed by many of Umaril's men equipped with weapons imbued with an ancient elven starlight magic that for the very first time was able to pierce Pelinal's armor and injure him pretty badly. Yet still, he ripped these elven minions apart and screamed for Umaril to come forward. Only once Whitestrake was weakened did the Ayleid king then descend and engage Pelinal in a one-on-one battle that would be sung about for millennia. Well, after a long, epic, back-and-forth affair, Pelinal at last landed a fatal strike, crumpling Umaril to the floor. But as the Elf King was dying, Whitestrake stood over him, frothing at the mouth, laughing and cursing his elven lineage when Umaril landed his very own mortal blow. Shocked, Pelinal too fell to the ground, and the remaining elven kings and Daedric minions leapt on his body, dismembering him into 8 pieces and carrying his corpse away. Pelinal's scream was apparently so loud and terrifying, it awoke Alessia and the human forces outside of the city, and Morahouse stormed inside to come to Pelinal's aid, but it was too late. All he found was the Crusader's severed head, quietly whispering thoughts of regret. In another in-game book called The Adabal Ah, it reads, "Then Pelinal spoke for the last time. Beware, Morahouse, beware. With the foresight of death, I know now that my foe yet lives, bitter knowledge to take to my grave. Better that I had died believing myself the victor. Although cast beyond the doors of night, he will return. Be vigilant. I can no longer shield the host of men from Umaril's retribution." And after this warning, the legendary Pelinal Whitestrake finally died. His crusade, bloody as it was, in many ways successful. The Ayleids were scattered and defeated. Alessia was free at last to found the first empire of men, a kingdom that would rule for over 2,000 years as the star-made night would slowly pass from memory into myth. Now that is some truly incredible stuff, I think. It feels like a twisted tale straight out of Arthurian myth, or just something else here in the real world that really has stood the test of time for centuries. Gotta give a huge shout out to Michael Kirkbride, man. Infamous former Bethesda writer and lore master that created not only Whitestrake, but so much of the more strange and interpretive lore in this series that has entertained us all for decades. And hey, maybe that villainous side of Pelinal, that madness, is what allowed these slaves to succeed in their uprising. Maybe without the racist doomslayer of Tamriel on their side, it would have been truly hopeless. But of course, this is not the end, as that final little speech Pelinal gave Morahouse is actually just the setup to the wonderful questline in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion known as the Knights of the Nine, the actual in-game content that introduced the world properly to the legend of Pelinal, and I would say with confidence it's one of my favorite quests in the entire series. Because Umaril, that bastard, was so clued in with the Daedric magics of Meridia, he had bound his very spirit to her realm of Oblivion, allowing him to cheat death and plan his revenge on the gods and men of Cyrodiil outside of time and space. And of course, it's just our luck that during our quest as the hero of Kvatch thousands of years later in the Third Era, he's finally ready to return. Well, it all starts out here with rumors of a chapel in Anvil being attacked and then another chapel in Berville. So you gotta track down this crazy-ass prophet guy on the streets of Anvil screaming at the top of his lungs about Umaril's return, the end of the world, and these ancient things called the Crusaders' relics that someone out there has to go gather quickly lest we all be doomed. And man, I love how the armor of Whitestrake has become this mythical lost arrangement of arms. I mean, it's cool storytelling, but it's also just great setup to simple game design, as you're of course gonna have to go out and complete a series of quests to acquire each piece. Well, lo and behold, after visiting shrines to pray to each of the 8 and 1 divines, you are deemed worthy of this task and enter a trance-like state where you are given a vision.
Your prayers have woken me from my endless dream. Or perhaps you have entered my dream and I still sleep. I think others have sometimes spoken to me. Others like you, but my memory is doubtful. Perhaps the others came after you. Your need must be great for the gods to allow us to speak. Has Umaril the Accursed found a way back? The foulest of a foul race. 1,000 curses upon his unholy name. I thought I'd won, but I should have known. The slave masters are a cunning breed. Umaril found a way to cheat death as I could not. If you would seek for my relics, I know little that can help you. All that has passed since my death is like mist that my mind cannot take hold of. My friends built a shrine upon the site of my death, where the elves tormented me in a final act of revenge. I can show you where it once stood. Perhaps it is there still. Fare thee well, Sir Knight. May the gods grant you to destroy Umaril utterly, as I failed to do.
Just so awesome to actually see this guy in-game, even in this ghostly form, and I think the remaster just made him look even more ethereal and cool. Now, spoiler alert, this is the only time you get to talk to Pelinal, but that is honestly for the best. You gotta keep his weird mythical-ass aura intact. Well, after going to this shrine of his death and finding the very first relic, his helmet, you come to discover a place called the Priory of the Nine. Now this is really cool. It's the home base of an order of knights that are all dead, but devoted their entire lives to tracking down each one of the Crusaders' relics. So by proving yourself noble enough to their ghosts and then befriending them, you get to learn the last known location of every part of the set, and thus the bulk of your journey begins. You're delving into ancient crypts, undoing old family curses, overcoming the trials of Kinnereth herself in the woods, and slowly but surely earning every single piece of the puzzle, donning the garb of the Divine Crusader to hopefully rise to the occasion and succeed where even Pelinal Whitestrake could not. Soon you learn that the ones attacking these divine chapels all around the province are Aurorans, Daedric minions of Umaril and Meridia, and after restoring the Order of the Nine with your very own loyal living knights, you get to take the fight to the Unfeathered directly at the Ayleid ruin of Garlus Malatar. But what's key here is that things have changed a lot since the First Era, and the 8 divines which Umaril was able to outsmart back in the day, well, those are now 9. Tiber Septim, or Talos, the great emperor of men, achieved apotheosis after his death and is now counted as one of the gods. So the X Factor is his blessing, which is also the blessing of humanity itself, and in a very flavorful way. You then have the upper hand on Umaril and have everything you need to banish him for good. You lead your knights into this fight like Whitestrake of old. You slay hordes of Aurorans and finally get to face down with the unfeathered in the flesh. And once you cut him down, following his spirit into Oblivion, where you war with him amongst the clouds in this epic final battle that's just sensational. And should you succeed here, you finally put an end to this threat once and for all, saving Cyrodiil from another age of enslavement and darkness before it can ever begin. I just think this is a great piece of content, man. It's always one of my most anticipated parts of any playthrough. It's just, I'm a sucker for the lore, you know what I mean? The red diamond banners in the priory, that stained glass ceiling, whew, everything about this just oozes with what makes the Elder Scrolls so unique and wonderful for me. Also, you gotta love that stupid-ass double standard that in-game you can't wear Pelinal's gear if you have any infamy or evil deeds to your name.
Wait a minute.
Now, in the overall scale of Oblivion and all the other shit going on in this story, it somehow still feels like a pretty inconsequential side adventure, which is honestly insane given everything we have covered in this video and the kind of historical significance of the threat that Umaril poses. I personally feel like this could have been a setup to an entire mainline Elder Scrolls quest and been a very good one, but hey, you know, that's video games, baby. Got the power bloat of being the savior of the world. So now that we know what this character apparently did in a historical/mythological sense, the heroic deeds and the atrocities, let's talk a little bit more about his actual nature, his morality, and of course, the weirder theory-rich side of things as well. Well, I gotta double and triple down on the fact that pretty much everything we have said in this video comes directly from that Imperial-centric legend and lore, which obviously hails this guy as a saint. But isn't it wild that even in those writings, there's still a lot of the not-so-great things covered, even listing some of his other less-than-flattering titles, like Pelinal Insurgent, Pelinal the Bloody, Pelinal the Blamer, and the Convolent Eradicator. We know for a fact that Khajiit absolutely detests this guy in their culture and refer to him as simply the White Snake, and you can only imagine what elven writings on the Crusader might paint him as. But what's really strange is that there are other groups in Tamriel that seem to have a foundationally different association altogether with this figure and remember him with names like Ysmir, which is fascinating, Harold Harrybreeks, which is funny, and Hans the Fox. So I think that Whitestrake, in a very realistic way, is meant to be one of those figures that has been endowed with all these titles and stories over time just because. Shoot, you could even make a very compelling argument that his entire legend is an amalgamation of like 10 different peoples, maybe even more. I mean, maybe half of these things are just bedtime stories that ended up getting written down and then taken seriously at some point. He's kind of like an Elder Scrolls version of Gilgamesh or Imhotep, and it's tantalizing from a player perspective to try to discern where the line might lie between truth and fantasy. But for what it's worth, as far as Pelinal's actual nature goes, it does seem like the majority of people in Tamriel, and of course over on Reddit, agree that he was real historically and was some sort of demigod. But demigod is actually kind of a vague term here in the Elder Scrolls series, defined as any divine yet not godlike being of, quote, unclear specifications. Some think this exclusively refers to offspring of the gods in the kind of classical sense like we use it, but others use the title to describe any super powerful spirit that they just don't really understand. Now, in the Song of Pelinal, Whitestrake describes himself and Morehouse as something called Ada, which is basically like a traditional demigod with one mortal parent and one god parent, but because we don't know anything about Whitestrake's parentage, it's impossible to know what he means by this. But an interesting little note is that Pelinal often referred to Morehouse as his nephew, so maybe there's some implied deeper connection to Kinnereth. I guess we'll never really know. But one prevailing, very strong belief is that Pelinal was something called the Shezarreen, and this is a whole other rabbit hole of lore in itself. But basically, a Shezarreen would be like a physical embodiment of Shezar, which is just the Cyrodiilic version of Lorkhan, the god of all mortals. So imagine like a fragment of the ultimate creator deity walking amongst his creations to just kind of check things out, maybe balance the scales of power here in Cyrodiil a little bit and go on a few murderous rampages. But interestingly, Shezar was considered in these ancient times to have left the humans of Cyrodiil to their own devices in some way, which some attribute to the Ayleids being able to enslave the Needs in the first place. But on the other hand, Shezar is also thought to be the spirit behind all ancient human action, and specifically the force behind them then resisting this elven aggression, so I can kind of see this being the case. But in the writings, we do see a moment where Whitestrake interacts with some Nords, and upon seeing him, they all claim that Shor has returned. Now, Shor is just the Nordic version of Lorkhan. It's the same thing, but in response, Pelinal spits at their feet in disgust. And then we have another man who exclaimed that Whitestrake was the Shezarreen, but that very night, he was smothered in his sleep to death by moths. So I don't really know what to tell you guys, man. It seems like Michael Kirkbride enjoyed writing all these little half-baked dead ends just to mess with us and make the character completely undefinable. And there's plenty of other things in this video that I haven't mentioned and won't mention, because honestly it's just too much. But despite all of that, another one of my favorite theories out there is the belief that Pelinal did not come down to Alessia along with Morahouse like we covered earlier, but he had actually already been in Tamriel for like thousands and thousands of years as this sort of ancient mythical nomadic hero, wandering around the world fighting under various names, raising armies, conquering lands, ruling as king, and then abandoning his kingdoms to wander and do it all over again. That he only really found a purpose when he was called upon by the gods. I really like that. But okay, above all else, what fans seem to want so badly to believe is that Whitestrake was indeed a time-traveling robot. So, okay, what the hell is this? I mean, where does it come from, and why has this cheeky concept now been widely accepted? Well, how about I just lay out all the evidence and let you draw your very own conclusions. So we already noted the bit about him screaming the name Remen, a man who wouldn't be born for another 2,500 years at least, which is definitely peculiar. We also covered the thing about him forming out of the red diamond unsectoring, which definitely sounds like robotic in some way, but it gets even more interesting when you read this line in the Song of Pelinal, Volume 1. He was Pelinal the Whitestrake because of his left hand made of a killing light. Now, this of course could be a reference to some sort of spell, destruction magic, or something divine that the simple Nedic people present just didn't understand back in the day, but because Pelinal is also described in these writings as casting a plague spell at some point, it's a little bit of a head-scratcher for sure. And while there are many people out there that have argued, oh, it's just this or that justifiable thing that suits the medieval fantasy setting, I mean, isn't it a little bit fun to think it was like a laser or a lightsaber or a gun or something? Then you throw into this mix that his decapitated head was able to speak to Morahouse at length, that he was rumored to have no beating heart, just a gem in his chest, that his armor was stated to be from the future. Not to mention, Michael Kirkbride himself claimed in an unofficial capacity online that yes, Pelinal was meant to be some sort of construct. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention that years after his brutal dismemberment and death, he apparently pretty casually attended the funeral of Alessia. Well, this is as good a time as any to highlight something that I think is very special. A popular fan animation called Pelinal, the animated opera made by a guy right here on YouTube named All in All, that I honestly credit with introducing millions and millions of people to not only Pelinal's weird gory lore, but that really badass potential of the whole cyborg thing. Now, unfortunately, for whatever reason, All in All has deleted or privated this video in the last year, I think, which is absolutely his right, it's his work, but man, it was just solid gold. Whitestrake's got a Mega Man cannon, and he scans for elven life forms like a T-100. Garfield is in there with the Khajiit about to get slaughtered. Just an incredible, humorous piece of work with a super catchy song in the background that I wish more people could still see today. But bringing this thing up is just to underline the fact that the robot theory is fun. It's that simple, especially when you expand the thought into Pelinal being like a weapon of some much larger metaphysical cyber war being waged across time by the gods. I mean, just to quote this fantastic Reddit comment I came across, "It's already fiction and you choose not to believe in gay Terminator? What a fool you are." But on a personal level, I'm gonna be honest, no. I choose to not believe that this character is a robot, and I don't think he's from the future. So in the really fun spirit of debating the in-game history here, allow me to propose a very simple counter theory. Well, remember what matters most is who is telling the tale. And I urge you to look again closely at any of the volumes in the Song of Pelinal to see that there is this note at the very start, indicating that nearly the entire song was taken long ago from the so-called Remen manuscript. And beyond just that, these volumes were first published during Remen's lifetime. Now, Remen Cyrodiil is another pretty mysterious yet impactful presence in the larger Elder Scrolls story in his own right. His is a tale about Tamriel being invaded by forces from the continent of Akavir and all these kind of scattered factions of men being reunited under one banner by Remen, allowing him to fight off the threat and establish a new era with the Second Empire. But listen, Times of war and political upheaval are tumultuous to say the very least. There's sure to be lots of cooks in the kitchen, lots of people gunning for leadership positions, so I like to think that Remen Cyrodiil, while jockeying for the throne, used the surely well-known legend of Pelinal Whitestrake for his very own gain. I imagine Remen's scribes drafting these volumes as we know them to not only add some sort of alien, inhuman aspects to the titular hero, but to revise the details and add Remen's name being shouted by Whitestrake in a moment of glory to make him appear to be some prophesied savior of Cyrodiil. You know, just good simple political propaganda, if you will. Not to mention that the name Remen means the light of man, so even if this Pelinal story is real, maybe he just got his name from it afterwards. But then I guess if that's true, all of the deeds that we just spent the last half hour yapping about could then all be a bunch of hooey fabrications for a power-hungry man later on in history. God, I love theory crafting, dude, especially in the Elder Scrolls. I feel like it's just open season when it comes to headcanons and homebrews and stuff. It's just the best. The title of this video declares that Pelinal Whitestrake is neither hero nor villain. But with everything that we have covered, perhaps it's more accurate to say that he is both. And this has very little to do with what you or I think of the character and his actions on a personal level, but much more with how the people of Tamriel remember Whitestrake themselves. And a huge part of this whole thing too, I think, is just the scale of time that we're really talking about here. I mean, the Alessian Uprising took place multiple thousands of years before the mainline games do. So that's the equivalent of you and I right now debating some shit that went down in the Bronze Age and trying to nail down all the he said, she said details to determine who the good guys were. I mean, I think anyway that ancient history really does start to feel like myth at a certain point, and so Whitestrake is just one of many, many Elder Scrolls figures that gets obscured in this way. Now, I can already hear the hundreds of you guys typing the comment, Pelinal did nothing wrong. And listen, that's not an incorrect opinion to have or anything, this is just a video game, it's not real. But art does imitate life, and Michael Kirkbride absolutely knew what he was cooking up when he made this character. You got slavery, racism, mass murder, homosexuality, revolution, religion. It's almost like he was trying to intentionally create something that every single person on the internet would be willing to argue about for the rest of time. A character that feels like an attempt at hog-tying our moral compasses and making us think just a little bit harder about who we choose to revere and who we choose to condemn. When gods send hands to break the chains, they care not what or whom is slain. A storm they loosed upon this land, not born of womb, nor shaped by hand. With every swing, a crown was crushed, and elven gore in rivers rushed, and when his blood at last grew still, the stars recoiled from such a will. So remember well the Whitestrake path, a hero's love, but a butcher's wrath.